Good morning, everyone. We got a lot to cover, so we'll go ahead and pick up back where we left off, talking about soil and water. And we're just talking about drainage and kind of going along with the whole irrigation thing. We were talking about controlling irrigation. We had a irrigation controller here in the greenhouse. Lots of different things that you can hook up to this. You can have irrigation that's getting more and more precise, and that's with improvements in technology. We can put timers on them. We can put sensors to see, when the soil is actually dry and needs moisture. So technology is greatly improving the efficiency of irrigation. On the drainage side, too dry, too wet is also a bad thing. So if we look at historically, a lot of areas in North America were once very poorly drained areas. And so we actually installed very extensive drainage systems in order to make them productive for agriculture. Near here in a place called Shady Valley, Tennessee, it was once basically a huge high elevation bog, and they drained it. Army Corps of Engineers came in and drained basically the entire valley to turn it into from a wetland into a very important agricultural area. And one of the things to note on this, when we're talking about soil and water, whenever we have too much water, I mentioned that plants cannot take up water or nutrients through the roots unless they are evolved to do so, unless they're wetland plants. So we often are having to drain these areas. And when we do that, we look at the soil type. The soil tends to be very dark in wetland situations, and that's mostly because organic matter just continue to accumulate, and it decomposes very slowly when it's wet. It becomes an anaerobic form of decomposition, which you get that sulfur byproduct where it's kind of get that rotten egg smell, kind of stinky. So one of the things that we can do is, dredging of waterways, adding of drain tiles. And in this case, we're talking about clay tiles or perforated plastic pipe buried underground. However, we try to discourage wetland draining these days because wetlands are such an important part of the ecosystem. As a biofilter, filtering out sediments and pollutants can be an important flood control, as well as just being habitat. Very important habitat for migratory species of birds and other animals. So while at one point in history we were draining a lot of wetlands to make it more important for agriculture, now we're trying to restore wetlands and also actually create more wetlands. So it's in a way, it's like a different kind of agriculture, restoration agriculture. And with technology, we've been able to begin to develop some drainage systems where we're still retaining the wetlands function in the ecosystem, but still having some places that we can conduct agriculture as well. All right, so moving on to maintaining fertility. I think the best thing for managing fertility is just to create a fertility program for the crop in question, because all plants use nutrients differently. So since about the Green Revolution, which we kind of look at as post-World War II up into the 60s and even into the 70s in some cases, we dramatically increased our use of fertilizers, basically to use what was left over from the war machine, use what we were making bombs with to make more synthetic fertilizers. And that, idea of that use of synthetic fertilizers has probably increased crop yields and reduced hunger more than any other single agricultural practice. There is the question, though, as to whether that is sustainable. And fertilizers, of course, can have a downside as well. They can pollute the environment and cause negative changes in soil characteristics. One of the things that I think is a big issue is that if we continue to use synthetic fertilizers, we're just replacing the nutrients, but we're not replacing a lot of the carbohydrates, really, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen that we find in organic matter. So we need to do a little bit of both. We need to apply organic matter in whatever form, whether that's cover crops, just tilling in crop residue, plowing it under, adding compost, manure, other forms of organic matter. So we can get positive benefits from using fertilizers, and we can get negative benefits. And one of the big negative benefits, that's an oxymoron, I'm sorry. A downside of using chemical fertilizers, the salt-based fertilizers in particular, is that salinization of soil that we talked about earlier. An important thing to think about and how fertilizers can pollute other ecosystems is that nutrients are lost from the soil depending on how mobile they are. Nitrogen, for instance, extremely mobile. It is the #1 pollutant of, well, #2. It's right behind sediment from soil erosion, but nitrogen runoff is the second largest pollutant of waterways. So as part of our fertilizer programs, looking at our crop, we want to try to dial in exactly what our crop needs. So we're utilizing just the amount, and we don't have extra nutrients that are easily run off, which is, it's difficult to do, but with a good fertility program saying, all right, I'm going to put this amount of these nutrients in the soil when I plant the crop and prepare the soil, and then I'm going to fertilize at this stage of development for the crop. We have to replace any nutrients that we remove. So by harvesting the crop, we're removing nutrients. We have to return them in some way. And synthetic fertilizers are a good way to do that. We just have to be careful of, how much and when we use them. So just the returning of crop residue itself to the soil is not going to replace all the removed nutrients. Especially if you think about how the crops are kind of concentrating their energy into the harvestable portions typically. So say we have a lettuce crop, for instance. Lettuce, all leafy greens use a lot of nitrogen, because nitrogen is that, one of the main components in the production of leaves. So anytime we harvest a head of lettuce, we got to put that amount of nitrogen back in the soil for use for the crop. Ideally in amounts equal to or slightly greater than those removed by the crop harvest. An important thing to note, though, is that we really have to look at the soil first. What type of soil is it? What is its nutrient holding capacity? Also, what are its chemical properties, like pH? So in this case, we have this machine applying lime to a field in a powder form, which we can get some, actual plant nutrition from lime, but it's also used to raise the pH. So our commercial kind of synthetic fertilizers are easier to apply and manage than manures and crop residues. But because of their importance in adding that organic matter back to the soil, those should not be disregarded. It's part of a whole system, really. So commercial fertilizers can also be expensive. That's another kind of downside of that. So sourcing your mineral nutrition is just as important. But adding both, fertilizers, and whether it's synthetic or a non-synthetic natural fertilizer, but also adding manure, crop residue, organic matter back to the soil, very important. So here's just an image of adding some dry fertilizer to a field before plowing, so that you're incorporating those nutrients in the soil profile. So here's an image of adding organic matter to improve the soil structure. So manure slurries, for instance, is one way to do that. So here they're doing that with a tank on the back of a truck. Excuse me. So when we're looking at developing a fertilizer program, first and foremost, we got to think about, what crops we're growing. In general, most of our field crops, we're adding those fertilizers at the beginning of the growing season, either before we're working the soil or afterwards when we're planting the crops. If we have a fertilizer program where we're having more frequent applications, then we need lower concentrations of each application. So that's kind of a more sustainable way to do it, considering that we're not adding a ton of nutrients at once that can easily be lost by their mobility, kind of percolating through the soil profile through the soil solution. So we have to look at applying the right fertilizer, the right amount of the fertilizer, and of course, being concerned about where that fertilizer is going to go. Many agricultural, large-scale production situations will have runoff ponds, places where they can kind of concentrate and hold those nutrients so they can, be more environmentally safe, shall we say. The over-application and misuse of fertilizers has resulted in pollution of surface and groundwater. So those programs, if we look at the fate of those unused nutrients, where they go. And this over-application, it's interesting to note that it's, we think of like, certified organic production, for instance, as being better environmentally. But in many cases, organic growers are just as guilty of over-applying and misusing fertilizers. Just a different form. And just because it's organic doesn't mean it's any more safe. It's still the same nutrients and can have the same negative effects. We think of complete fertilizer as containing the 3 primary macronutrients and amounts of each of them. So the 3 being N, P, and K, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And when we look at that on a bag of fertilizer, these are expressed as percentages. So in this soluble fertilizer here, this 15, 16, 17, it's got 15% nitrogen, 16% phosphorus, and 17% potassium, the N, P, and K there. So if that was a 100-pound bag, then we've got 15 pounds of nitrogen, 16 pounds of phosphorus, and 17 pounds of potassium. The important thing to note here is that that doesn't add up to 100%, does it? So what is that? What are these nutrients bonded to? What is the molecular makeup of these soluble fertilizers? And so that's just as important, I think, as the nutrients themselves, because they're more available in certain formulations and less available in others. And there are reasons to use both. You might use one that is less available, more long-term available in situations where the crop is going to be there for a longer period of time in the season. So every bag of fertilizer will also have the content analysis, where often some sources of where those nutrients are coming from and what they're bonded to. So we're going to look at that percentage of each primary nutrient They don't always include the compounds that are used to make up the fertilizer, though, especially if that's proprietary information. If we know that formulation, then we can, manipulate how we're applying that fertility to the soil. So it's important to know, and sometimes not difficult, or it's not always easy to get that information. So we look at the physical properties as well, especially, how it's bonded. So whether it's a liquid fertilizer or a granular fertilizer, a powder, and how those act, especially some of the powders and granular fertilizers sometimes can cake together in high moisture situations, which makes them more difficult to evenly apply. So again, looking at the plant's requirements, most crops do have somewhat similar nutritional requirements in that they, require all 17 essential elements. However, many crops do have particular needs and sensitivities. So all of our fertilizer programs, we need to be testing the soil, testing our growing media, as well as, in some cases, testing the plant tissues as well. And that can be just, kind of looking at the crop, kind of monitoring it visually, as well as actually testing the tissues. There is equipment out there to do that. And ideally, we want to make tests at the very minimum at the beginning of each crop or growing season, or slightly before it. And then, at some point, through the production of the crop, if we start to see deficiency symptoms. So the chemical properties are also extremely important, and one of the biggest ones is the pH. So the availability of particular nutrients is really determined by pH. And rather than just read this off, we'll look at a chart here in just a second. We can adjust the soil pH depending on the buffering capacity of the soil by adding calcium carbonate or lime to increase the soil's pH, or by adding acid-forming chemicals such as aluminum sulfate, a lot of sulfur compounds, basically to lower that pH, make it more acidic. So here's a chart of just looking at the availability of nutrients to plants as they are influenced by the soil's pH. And right here, this line is neutral, 7 on the pH scale. The higher we get, the more alkaline it is. The lower we get, the more acidic it is. And for the greatest availability of the widest range of nutrients, it's right there at 7. Even though iron and manganese are slightly more available in acidic soil, and some nutrients are slightly more available in a basic soil, right around neutral is kind of our sweet spot. And indeed, a lot of people will refer to neutral as that sweet soil. So pH, very important. Cation exchange capacity, we talked about how it's basically how these positively charged ions of the nutrients are held in the soil. And generally, the more clay content or organic matter content of the soil, the higher the cation exchange capacity is. We have things like sand, for instance, that has little or no ability to hold cations. So we think of clay as being bad for drainage, but it's good for holding nutrients. The best, though, is organic matter, getting that humic principle in the soil. In some cases, such as closed hydroponic systems, we don't want to have much cation exchange capacity because the nutrients are being supplied, constantly through the actual growing solution itself. It's also important to look at the anion exchange capacity. For instance, nitrate NO3 minus there, it's a negatively charged ion. It is, only taken up through anion exchange capacity. So we need to look at both. cation exchange capacity alone is not an indicator of what nutrients will necessarily be available, though, because especially if it's a higher clay soil, so knowing that soil texture structure is important as well. The nutrients might be there, they just might not be available because they're tightly bound to the soil particles themselves. So looking at different ways of actually applying nutrients, fertilizers to soils or to crops. In some cases, we can do gas injection into the soil, solids and liquids. They can be supplied in the form of organic matter, kind of more slowly breaking down and really kind of working with that soil microbiology. You can also use powders and dusts, granules and pellets, as well as liquid fertilizers, whether it's a manure slurry like we saw in that image being applied earlier, or just soluble fertilizers dissolved in water. There are some nutrients like iron that are not soluble in water, so these have to be chelated with a soluble molecule attached to the nutrient to improve their solubility. When that chelate goes into the solution, it will take the nutrient with it. We also have fertigation, where we're applying soluble fertilizers in the irrigation water. This is used mostly with drip irrigation, very often used in more horticultural operations, more intensive cultivation, landscaping, nurseries, greenhouses, etc. And in that case, we have a high frequency of low concentrations of the nutrients, almost constantly being irrigated. So we look at that as expressing those nutrients and fertilizers in parts per million of a dilute solution. And we also have to have some sort of fertilizer injector to get that concentrated solution to be prepared and put in at a precise amount. So here's just some examples of fertilizer injectors. You can have it on kind of a large scale, like this fertilizer injector being used in a greenhouse, or smaller scale, a little easier, this dosatron right here, where we're basically, it's attached to a dolly, we're moving it around, but often having to apply that to each particular situation. We can also use hose end fertigation methods as well, and those often have some sort of mixing, a mixer near the where the hose is hooked up to faucets. All right, so that's it for now on the fertilizers. Any questions there, comments or concerns? All right, well, we're going to switch over into pest management here. Talk a little bit about what I refer to. We used to kind of just say pest management in general. Now we're saying, why this is working here. Okay. For some reason, this isn't going into slideshow. There we go. All right. We now refer to it as the integrated management of pests, or IPM. And so the difference here is that, historically we were looking at just controlling pests, but now we're looking more, and all growers now are really looking at integrated management, not just controlling the pests, but how do you prevent the pests in the first place? So since the beginning of agriculture, we've always had to have some sort of way to manage any pest, whether it's a weed, insect, a disease. We have annual losses in all of our crops, whether that's a food, fiber, or even ornamental production, that are caused by these pests. And it's estimated that the losses are in hundreds of billions of dollars. Worldwide, we can lose up to 50% of crop production in 1 year. And we're also spending billions of dollars on the control of pests. So it makes the whole pest management industry a multi-billion-dollar industry. And we kind of break that down into the different parts, and kind of have to be a well-rounded scientist thinking about the control of pests here. So looking at weed science, study of insects or entomology, and also plant pathology, the study of plant diseases and how plants are just produced in general. No matter what we're controlling, what pests we have, we need to take this integrated pest management approach, looking at it kind of as a whole system. Basically, we're looking at using several methods and using a bunch of different tools all together to prevent and control pests. So we look at our cultural practices often first, and that's thinking of things like just one, providing the optimal environment for the plant. A healthy plant is naturally has defenses that are able to ward off most pests. And I mean, we can see that in natural ecosystems. We don't really see a whole lot of major pest damage until we've disturbed that ecosystem, or until we've introduced a pest that is not native to it. So that is kind of along with our agricultural production as well. A healthy plant can fight off. It has a natural defense. It's not going to be able to fight off everything, but if we focus first on the cultural practices, being sanitary, managing the nutrients, managing the chemical properties of the soil, pH, making sure that we have the right irrigation. A healthy plant is a stronger plant, is usually a less pest-prone plant. Then we look kind of along with that at the host resistance. If you have a perennial pest problem, then you want to look at the genetics of your crops. There are lots of resistant varieties out there to insects, disease, and in some cases even weeds. And then we look at biological controls, and finally, actually using chemical applications to control pests. So here are 5 methods for managing plant pests. First, cultural practices, including the genetic resistance, minimizing the presence of the pests in the first place. Then we look at physical and mechanical controls, things like just the maintenance of the crop, pruning. Let's say we're growing tomatoes, for instance, whether that's outdoors or indoors in a greenhouse. There's natural dieback of leaves, and if we remove those leaves, then we're limiting the ability for pests to have habitat and places to actually infest plants. We also look at hand removal of some pests in some cases. Although not practical on a large scale, it can be effective in some cases. We also use traps as well for pests, including other crops as traps. We also look at the chemical applications. IPM does not rule out the use of chemicals. It just saves it for last. And I think really it's not just the environmental approach either. It's just the economic approach. And ideally, IPM was kind of developed to make crop production more sustainable. And when we're talking about sustainability, we need to think about it's not just the environmental aspect. We also have to think about the economic and the social aspects as well. So for the use of chemicals, if it's warranted, if it makes sense to spend that money on the chemical to use it, then by all means. So we use pesticides, and all pesticides are broken down into the category of what they're controlling. Herbicides, for instance, control herbs, plants, other weeds. Insecticides, of course, control insects. Important to note the difference between insects and mites. An insecticide is not going to control mites, so we need to use miticides because they're in a totally different class of organism. Also look at antibiotics, controlling bacteria, as well as these days we're also looking at probiotics, those that we're using to, good bacteria to fight off the bad bacteria. Fungicides controlling fungi, and nematicides controlling nematodes. There's all kinds of other pesticides out there as well, rodenticides controlling rodents. Some of them more specific in controlling particular types of pests, some of them more general. We also look at biological control, the use of other living organisms to manage our plant pests. And also, some people would lump this in with cultural practices, but there are government regulatory measures as well. If anybody's traveled to California in recent years, you're going to come across a roadblock at some point, and they're going to ask you, do you have any, are you carrying any fresh produce or firewood? And if you do, they will inspect it. So basically, we're looking at quarantining those pests, preventing pests from traveling and moving into areas. In some cases, we also have pest eradication programs through local, state, and federal government. So as a pest manager, we want to consider all the complexities of this unique system being managed to develop IPM strategies that meet the producer's needs as well as the crop's needs itself. So trying to think about, ideally using, kind of in steps. So using the preventive measures first. So the cultural practices include involving, anything that favors the plant's development and minimizes the pests or pathogens activity in the first place. So getting that optimal environment, having the right amount of light, water, and nutrients to maximize the plant's growth, healthy plants. So we have a disease or pest triangle to kind of illustrate this concept. And basically, we're looking at here, the base of the triangle, the host. The host has to be susceptible for the other, issues to actually become a problem. We also have to have the presence of the pathogen, whether that is in, in the case of the fungus, in the spore form, or the actual physical presence of the mycelium, whatever it is that we're looking at, as well as a favorable environment. So we have to have all three occurring at the same time in order to actually have the pest there and able to do damage. So looking at using cultural practices, one thing that we can do is just practice proper tillage as a way to control either emerged or unemerged weeds. Also burying survival structures of plant pathogens. So whether it's a disease or insect, often they're laying their eggs in crop residues. If we can get them underground, then they might be less available, or in some cases, we might be tilling in order to bring some of these like insect eggs to the surface so that other predators, the natural biological controls can, actually eat them. Of course, we look at the drainage and the irrigation as well to manage pests and diseases. In some cases, we can remove pests through a blast of water from a plant's surface. Well-watered plant is less susceptible to diseases and other pests. On the fertility aspect, we look at that as both over and under fertilization. If we have over-fertilized plants, then that creates the soft, kind of succulent tissue that a lot of insects like to feed on. Under-fertilized plants might not have strong tissues that make them more susceptible to pathogens and insect attack. Crop rotation is a huge cultural practice that we look at especially for the management of diseases. If you have, say, tomato blight, for instance, in a spot, you don't want to grow tomatoes in that same spot for, at least 3 years. If you remove those crop residues, the habitat, the host plant, then eventually the pathogen will fail and die. And a lot of times these diseases, are there, in the soil kind of overwintering, waiting for that host to come back. If the host doesn't come back, it can't persist and it eventually just dies. Crop rotation is also important just for managing fertility as well. An important thing to look at is just the removal and destruction of anything that is infected or infested, whether that's the crop itself, maybe the soil or media, depending on the case. You might look at sterilizing that or removing it in some cases. We also look at the use of certified pathogen or weed-free seed, or in the case of like potatoes, there's certified disease-free seed potatoes out there too, and other propagules. We also want to make sure that our equipment is clean. Anything that we're using, if it gets infected, you have the fungal spores on it, then by plowing, then you can be reinfesting your soil with those diseases. So sanitation is very important. On the genetic front, we're looking at those that are naturally genetically resistant to whatever the pest is, try to avoid or minimize losses caused by those pests, which is not always easy, but I think, you know, when you're kind of overwintering, you know, maybe you're not doing a lot of production in the winter, it's a good time to be looking at resistant varieties out there, looking through the seed catalogs. Especially today, they've developed a lot of modern varieties of tomatoes that are resistant to particular diseases. We can also look at that in orchards as well, using disease-resistant rootstock to graft your scion wood onto. Because in nature, you know, plants that are susceptible to a prevalent disease will often disappear, leaving the resistant types. This kind of works both ways on the resistance front, for the crops, for plants in nature, but also for the pests. The pests become resistant to particular chemicals, for instance. Many cultivars and varieties have been developed through traditional breeding and selection, as well as genetic engineering, to maintain yields in spite of heavy disease or insect pest pressure. So, you know, look for those varieties out there, do the research, know those varieties before you even plant the crop. We're talking about actually using pesticides and controlling chemicals, controlling pests through the use of chemicals. Just like with the fertilizers, we want to look at the different ways of applying them. So some cases, even with our proper cultural practices and our genetic resistance, we still have pest problems. And if that crop, you know, economically warrants it, then you'll want to actually, you know, apply a pesticide, whether it's you know, an OMRI approved, which is kind of the certified organic approved pesticides, or a synthetic pesticide. So we can look at that as crop dusting from plane, or nowadays also using unmanned aerial systems, drones, to do that, or specialized equipment to apply pesticides as well, such as in this orchard, using a kind of fine mist sprayer to get good coverage on all the leaf surfaces of taller trees. So pesticides, we kind of look at as, you know, the last effort, the last ditch effort here, the least desirable method of managing insects and plant diseases. And, you know, again, one of the big deals is just the cost of it. We're already working on kind of, you know, slim margins in agriculture often. So whatever we can do to prevent an increase in production costs, the better. We want to try to, you know, get more cents, more dollars back in the pocket of the farmer. So more cents on the dollar. Also, we have dangers to humans. I mean, that's why this guy here applying, looks like to Easter lilies, applying this pesticide. He's got a respirator on, full body coverage of that PPE, that protective equipment. There can also be damage to the environment, food products, livestock, wildlife, also beneficial other biological controls, as well as the atmosphere. So different pesticides have different dangers, so it's important to know the pesticide very well. And you'll talk about this, especially when you're doing your pesticide applicators test. The label is the law. You have to apply pesticides in conjunction with the label itself. Technically, it's a contract between the manufacturer of the pesticide, the user of the pesticide, as well as the seller of the pesticide. So you have to use it properly. On the biological control front, we're looking at using other organisms to control pests, and this is often an environmentally friendly alternative to the use of pesticides, but it doesn't always give the consistent control of pests. And it's because we're looking at this kind of as an ecosystem dynamic. So the biocontrols kill or suppress by different methods, either by actual parasitization, where, for instance, we use parasitic wasps in here in our greenhouse. They will actually come in and lay their eggs in the body of the insect pest or pathogen, and then they hatch. The larva eats the organism from the inside out. Kind of crazy. It's like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We can also just have them be competing with pests and pathogens for space and nutrients, producing toxins that kill or make the pests and pathogens sick or less desirable, also inducing physiological or biochemical changes in the crop itself and making it less susceptible or less desirable to pest, pathogen, or attack. So one downside of biological control is that you are often introducing organisms. And I think this is just a consequence, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, as of just globalized trade. The chestnut blight, for instance, happened because we introduced Chinese, Asian varieties of chestnuts here to North America. And in doing so, we didn't know that it was harboring this blight, that this disease that came through and killed all these American chestnuts. So historically we've done a lot of this, introducing organisms to try to control pests, sometimes with negative effects. The Asiatic ladybird beetle, for instance, those little ladybugs that come in your home in the winter, those were introduced to try to control the hemlock woolly adelgid. So we have intentional introductions that can be bad, as well as unintentional introductions. And that's one way that we look at those government regulatory measures. Often there's years and years of research that go into managing and introducing exotic controls. So we look at the use of the quarantines and those being implemented by local, state, regional, or national, and in some cases even international agencies and authorities to try to prevent the spread of pests and disease in the first place. So the big issue that we have here with the globalized trade is that, and when an exotic pathogen is introduced to a population that didn't co-evolve with it, then there's likely to be very dramatic effects. We have found that over time, though, they do start to catch up. So the natural ecology, we've started to see native ladybugs eating the hemlock woolly adelgid, for instance. So, I mean, there's a lag there, but it's the dynamics of ecology, basically the pests and predator populations, you're kind of keeping that at equilibrium. Eventually it does catch up in most cases, not in all though. So we look at strict government inspections and quarantines, as well as certification programs to kind of manage that. So we'll talk a little bit about the different types of pests as we move through this chapter. First, weeds. And a weed, I kind of define as a plant whose virtues have yet to be well understood. And I say that mostly because there are there are tremendous problems with weeds. They compete with our plants, but many of them, were brought over for a reason. They have some sort of use. And I think if we understand why they were brought over, we might be able to actually, use the weed rather than just spend lots and lots of money on trying to control it. I think a good example of that is the dandelion. It's notorious for issues in turf. And as in an ornamental situation, we want to remove any dandelions from our turf grasses. However, what are dandelions doing? Why are they there? So any pests, you want to think about, why is it here in the first place? With dandelions, they're actually bringing nutrients from the subsoil with their long, like 6 foot plus tap roots. They're bringing it up to the topsoil. So often they occur in places where the soil fertility is poor, and where the soil is disturbed to be able to actually allow that weed to be established in the first place. So on weeds, we look at them as competing with our crops for water, nutrients, and sunlight. They can also interfere with our harvesting or just reduce our crops' quality and appeal. They can also harbor undesirable insects, pathogens, or nematodes, and compete with our crops for the good guys, the pollinating insects. So those characteristics are important to look at in the weed world. We also want to classify weeds by their life cycle, whether they're annuals, biennials, or perennials. Understanding how, and this goes for all pests, not just weeds, but understanding the life cycle is a key component of managing that pest. So if it's a perennial, usually we want to try to remove perennials before we even work the soil, ideally, or while we're working the soil. A lot of perennials have specialized specialized plant parts that when you are tilling, when you're actually breaking them up, they're able to propagate and make new plants. So we'll also look at the term invasive weeds, which basically we're talking about those that are very aggressive and are not native to the ecosystem in question. Most of these are non-native, but we can have them to, can have native plants as long as they're not native to that ecosystem, if that makes sense. Which the agroecosystem are, agriculture, it's a modified ecosystem. So, what is native to it, what is not native, we're kind of looking at the natural ecosystems around it. We also look at the invasives as those whose introduction is likely or does cause economic or environmental harm, as well as harm to human health. Some of these invasive weed species, it's kind of abstract, but for instance, the Amur honeysuckle tends to harbor deer ticks that cause Lyme's disease. So they don't directly cause human health problems, but more indirectly. And generally they're very aggressive, and they basically are causing problems across the board to plants, to other animals, and other organisms as well. And generally just very economically devastating. So on that note, we'll stop here on weeds, and we'll come back to this on Wednesday. Any questions, comments, or concerns there on starting the insect pest management or integrated pest management?
The slides aren't up there in Canvas yet.
All right, thank you. I'll put those up right now.
Which the Canvas login thing, the my.bccs.edu is apparently broken at the moment, though. So everybody has to log in the normal or the direct way if they can.
Right.
So